Well, it's 6 o'clock and we can see that quite a few of you have already logged in, which is terrific. And welcome to everybody to this talk by Joe Studholme in aid of the Woodford Valley Churches. We are so delighted that so many of you wanted to hear Joe's talk, and this has been made possible by the generous loan of a Zoom link through the Art Society Wylie Valley, and also to thank Robin Fair, who's done much in the background with his technical help. This talk will be recorded so other people in a different time zone can enjoy it, and also we can all listen again. The link to that will be sent to you once it's been uploaded. Joe is very happy to take questions at the end of the talk. You will have seen a slide earlier showing you where the chat button is. If you click on that, and you can then type in anything you want to ask, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible at the end. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Joe Studholme, who in 1962 joined forces with some university friends and set up Editions Electo. Initially, they were printing contemporary art, including David Hockney's A Rake's Progress. And then in 1979, they formed partnerships with museums and art galleries to try to print more historical works. And it was at this time that Joe discovered the exquisite copper plates that Joseph Banks had commissioned, still in their original paper. So tonight, Joe is going to tell us about Captain Cook's voyage, how the botanical specimens were gathered, and how it became his quest to print and publish what is now known as Banks's Floral Legion. So Joe, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Julia, for that extremely nice introduction, and good evening. And any of my Australian and New Zealand friends really are watching live now instead of waiting for a recording. Good morning. Well, very good to do that. What I'm going to do is to tell you something of the Endeavour voyage itself, and then touch on the botanical and scientific results of the voyage. And finally, as Julia says, how it came about that the final publication of the Floral Legion, the botanical record, was only completed over 200 years later by a small independent publishing company in London. The purpose of the Endeavour voyage always sounds to me rather romantic. It was to sail to the South Seas to observe and chart the transit of Venus, which was an astronomical phenomenon, technically called a solar parallax, which, if carefully observed from different points around the globe, would enable one to make a very accurate reckoning of the distance between the Earth and the Sun, which has been extremely valuable for navigation and map making in the 18th century. And the transit only happens twice every 100 years at quite close intervals. And the observation in 1761 had been a flop because the weather was very cloudy. And the next transit was on the 3rd of June, 1769, and after that, not until 1874. So the Royal Society, with support from the Admiralty and a very healthy subvention from George III, who put up £4,000, decided to mount an expedition. And the place chosen was Tahiti, which then called King George III's Island, and had only been discovered 3 years before by Captain Sam Wallis in HMS Dolphin, who had reported that it had a good harbour and friendly natives. And in those pre-woke days of adventure and exploration, the commander of the expedition was to have secret orders to search for the great southern continent, which at that time was thought must exist to balance the land mass at the top of the globe. And the naval officer who was selected to command the expedition was James Cook, recently promoted from master to lieutenant. But in fact, coming from a very humble background, he was the son of a Yorkshire labourer, went to the local school, was put into the grocery trade, which he thoroughly disliked, and opted instead to be apprenticed to John Walker, who ran coal business out of Whitby. And Cook learned his navigation and sailing skills, slipping in and out of the shallow estuaries up and down the east coast, and indeed might have remained a skipper in the merchant navy all his life if during the French wars he elected to enlist in the Royal Navy as a able seaman, possibly because he feared he might be press ganged. And in the Navy, his talents as a sailor were quickly recognized. And by the 1760s, he was widely acknowledged to be the finest navigator, chart maker, and also astronomer in the Navy. And Cook was given carte blanche to choose any ship he wanted. And instead of choosing a naval vessel with a deep keel, he opted instead to buy secondhand a ship which he knew very well indeed, a East Coast collier, officially called a cat-built bark, and actually almost certainly the same sort of cat as accompanied Dick Whittington to London. And she was an ideal choice for a voyage of exploration, an enormous hold, very shallow drafts, and almost flat bottom, so that it's very easy to beach if they fell into trouble, and certainly saved their lives when they were shipwrecked on the Barrier Reef. But my word, she was small. I mean, tiny little ship, 368 tons, 110 feet long. That's about the length of 3 London buses. And in this very small ship were squashed a complement of 84, including 12 Marines, and a quantity of livestock, pigs and sheep and chickens, and a very famous nanny goat who had already been around the world with Captain Wallace to provide milk for the officers' table. Honestly, it makes one itch even to think about it. And when the whole ship was really fitted out, just I should have shown you, here you see the inside of the ship. When the ship was entirely fitted up, Joseph Banks appeared on the scene, scion of a wealthy Lincolnshire landowning family who had come into an enormous income of £6,000 a year on his 21st birthday. And at 25 could be described as a gentleman of large fortune, well-versed in natural history, on the basis of his studies at Oxford and a recent natural history trip to Newfoundland and Labrador. And Banks is said to have first heard of the Endeavour voyage at a dinner party and immediately decided he wanted to join. And of course, everyone tried to dissuade him and go on the grand tour like other young gentlemen, which provoked a much quoted response. Every blockhead does that. My grand tour will be around the world. And by pulling every conceivable string, most productively with his neighbour and friend, Lord Sandwich, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty, and actually a clincher was he was going to pay for the whole thing himself. He was given permission to assemble a scientific party and joined the Endeavour with a party of 8, of whom the 2 most important were Carl Solander, Dr. Carl Solander, star pupil of the great Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, and then a rather sedentary curator at the British Museum. And as a natural history artist, this very young 23-year-old Edinburgh Quaker, Sidney Parkinson, who Banks had already employed to draw some of his Newfoundland plants, and was employed by James Lee, the celebrated Hammersmith nurseryman. And as well as them, the other two important people were Herman Sporing as secretary and occasional artist. He was also a Swede, actually born in what is now Finland and always claimed by the Finns. And as a landscape artist, Alex Buchan, who sadly died of an epileptic fit as soon as they arrived in Tahiti, and therefore vastly increased Parkinson's workload. And as well as them, there were 2 servants from Banks's Lincolnshire estates, and 2 black servants from his house in London, and 2 greyhounds, 2 of his favourite greyhounds. Take that order, very personal. Thanks to Banks's largesse, he apparently spent over £6,000, probably well more than 500,000 today. The expedition could be described, it was described as no people ever went to sea better fitted out for the purpose of natural history, with a very fine library and every sort of contrivance and container for collecting and preserving natural history specimens. But my word, it was an incredibly hazardous venture. There were plenty of people who thought, who thought they'd never come back. Gilbert White, the naturalist, wrote, if he survives, with what delight shall we peruse his journals, his flora, his fauna. And Dr. Johnson, who visited the Endeavour while she was being refitted at Deptford, was rather given to the acerbic quip, remarked, going to sea was like going to jail with the added prospect of drowning. And Banks and his party joined the Endeavour at Plymouth, and after a rather tiresome wait for a fair wind, they set sail from Plymouth Sound on the 25th of August, 1768. It must be confessed at a fairly stately, rather stately pace, with all her sails set and wind behind her. The top speed for the Endeavour was not much more than 6 knots. Somebody rather unfairly said it was like walking around the world. And Joseph Banks always described the Endeavour in his journals as Mrs. Endeavour because she had such a big, flat bottom. And our first port of call was Madeira, but actually was only to collect their wine. And although Banks did fit in a couple of days botanizing, and the first 11 plates in the Floral Legion of Madeira plants, including this one, Sibthorpia peregrina, which is the Madeira moneywort. But then really began the proper part of the voyage, which was, and they crossed the Atlantic, the 8-week journey across the Atlantic to Rio de Janeiro, where they expected to have a very warm welcome, and were very put out when they discovered that the governor of Rio wouldn't accept that this miserable little collier was an official party, and thought there must be buccaneers or pirates. Wouldn't allow Cook to go, wouldn't allow any of the crew to go ashore except for Cook. And Banks and Solander were left in a flurry of frustration because they could see this wonderful vegetation on the shore and got up to all sorts of odd tricks, sending the sailors ashore to collect plants when they were collecting fodder for the animals, and even rather foolishly, I think, slipping ashore in the ship's pinnace to collect plants, as indeed they did. They found got some wonderful plants, of which 23 ended up in the Floral Legion. The one on the right, an orchid vine, and the one on the left is the first depiction of a bougainvillea. And I don't think they were actually very sad to leave Rio and go on the long reach down the South American coast. And by this time, they'd already established a shipboard routine, in which actually they remained constant throughout the voyage. And everywhere they made a landfall, Banks and Solander and their collectors went ashore and gathered plants. And then they came back into the great cabin, which wasn't very great, and went through the collection and passed to Sidney Parkinson any specimen which was new to European botany or particularly interesting. And Parkinson made a field sketch while the specimen was still fresh, with a lot of colour notes on the back. And then when they were at sea, worked it up into a finished portrait. And then Spurring entered botanical details in the books. And the plants were pressed and dried, I always think rather suitably, between the pages of Joseph Addison's commentary on Milton's Paradise Lost, which turned out to be extremely good absorbent paper, but I think must have been a pretty poor seller in 1768. And Banks, for some reason, wanted to call it the Falkland Islands, but Cook had a deadline to meet and pressed on to the extreme south of the continent, Tierra del Fuego, where they had an absolutely disastrous episode, which might have scuppered the whole natural history part of the expedition, because Banks totally misjudged the topography on a strip of shore, and they got stuck in a snowstorm overnight. Poor Buchan had his first epileptic fit, and Solander very nearly died. And the two black servants who had been entrusted with the bottle of rum fell into a snowdrift and perished. And Banks, on the whole, was unfazed by all of this. The very next day, he was botanizing again. And they did collect a lot of plants, 70 plants in the end, from Tierra del Fuego. A lot of them very, very small and little tiny mossies. And sometimes you get an absolutely jewel-like little plant, which the interesting thing about, one of the interesting things about the Floral Legion is that Parkinson drew everything at life size. So you get this tiny little plant in the middle of a large sheet of paper, too small, I'm afraid, for your laptop. And then the most dangerous part of the voyage began, the rounding of Cape Horn. Can you imagine what it'd be like, a little flat-bottomed 300-ton boat? This is a rather romanticized 19th century watercolor, and you get a slightly better idea, I think, of this absolutely contemporary sketch by Sidney Parkinson. They duly did get round the Horn safely, and then began the 11-week voyage across the 4,000 miles from Cape Horn to Tahiti. And Julie found this little pinprick of an island in the middle of the Pacific. It's the most extraordinary feat of navigation, with no chronometer and very basic navigational tools. And they duly arrived in Tahiti on the 12th of April, 1769. And it absolutely lived up to Captain Wallace's description. A very good harbor, lots of food and fruit, and extremely friendly natives, both male and female, which Banks and really the whole crew took good advantage of. The only people who granted didn't was Captain Cook himself, Lieutenant Cook then himself, and the young Quaker draftsman who remained chastely at his easel, complaining that the flies ate his paint. And Mr. Green, the astronomer, oh, here it is, I keep on forgetting to do it. That's a lovely picture of the harbor at Tahiti. Mr. Green, the astronomer, set up this quite elaborate observation post and Fort Venus. And on June the 3rd, they did have a successful observation of the transit. And while Cook sailed around the archipelago, charting and naming other islands, actually with one of the Tahitian chieftains, Poupee, who turned out to have been an absolute natural navigator. And Banks and Solander had an absolute field day botanizing, and ended up with 89 plates in the Floral Legion. The flower on the left, Thespesia populnea, is actually a quite well-known English greenhouse plant. And then after 2.5 months in this tropical paradise, amazing feat of Cook's discipline, he rounded up the crew to go back into that little wooden prison, having retrieved 2 of the Marines who had gone AWOL with their Tahitian wives, and with the compliment added to by Poupee and a Tahitian boy, and possibly his son, paid for by Banks, on the basis, as proved right, that he might be useful in translating from native language other places they landed. And the other reason, not actually now entirely politically correct, that Banks thought it very nice to be able to exhibit him to his friends in London as the noble savage. And then began the second part of the voyage to search for the great southern continent. And Cook sailed further south than anyone had ever been before, to 40 degrees latitude in terrible weather, and finally gave it up and turned northeast. And with a relatively few days, hit land. And Banks and quite a lot of the other people who kept diaries entered in their journals that they'd found the great southern continent. And then after sailing round 2 islands for 6 months, of course, reluctantly had to agree that it wasn't the great southern continent, but New Zealand, which in fact had been discovered by Tasman in 1642. And the welcome from the natives, indigenous people in New Zealand, was quite different from Tahiti. The Maoris were actually very fierce and warlike. In fact, some of them were cannibals. And there was one unfortunate incident when two Maoris were shot and killed, much to the upset of Cook and Banks. It wasn't at all their idea. Banks, again, was quite unfazed. Cook read about him that he had superabundant energy, never troubled by fear at any time. And again, with a slight lack of what we'd say now normal political correctness, he bought a shrunken head for his collection. They weren't at all impressed by the fauna in New Zealand, only dogs and rats. But the flora was absolutely wonderful. Keep on forgetting to press the button. This is one of the Maori cannibals, and the flora here I was going to put in was glorious. The hibiscus on the left is particularly nice, and was actually a very good wood. It was used for fishing boats. And the glory flower on the right is again a greenhouse plant. And they also, of course, collected a lot of ferns, a great feature of New Zealand botany. And these, in fact, were the only plants which Parkinson didn't draw in colour. And when we were publishing the prints, we went back to the living specimens to get the right colour in the plate. And then occurred a very rare event describing something happened actually on the Endeavour, which was a discussion between the gentlemen and the officers to decide which way they'd go home. It was a bit late in the year to go around Cape Horn where they came, and they didn't really want to go as it were straight back to the Cape of Good Hope, because there would be no land to discover on the way. And as actually everybody knows, they turned northeast to hope to find the east coast of Terra Australis. And on the 28th of April, 1770, Lieutenant Hicks duly sighted land, very shortly to be called Point Hicks. And after sailing up the coast for 2 or 3 days, they landed at Stingray Bay, very quickly to be renamed Botany Bay for obvious reasons, and immediately began botanizing. This is a lovely abutyl and albescent on the left, and the little lobelia dentata on the right is like many of the Australian plants, it only flowers after bushfires. And once again, the welcome from the indigenous people, the natives, was quite different. The Aboriginals were very shy, and it said that when the Endeavour was sailing up the coast, they could see the people on shore working, and they just simply didn't look up from their work. The idea of a ship of that size was so beyond their imagination. And when they landed, they first ran away. And it is said that the first words which from an Aboriginal they heard, which Banks duly noted in his vocabulary, was "go away." And they then began the 3 month journey up the east coast of Australia within the barrier reef, naming and charting as they went. And then on the 10th of June, I mean, real disaster struck. They went firmly aground at the top of the tide on the coral reef. And after 2 excruciating days when they threw everything overboard, which they could move, and by dint of extremely skilled seamanship, they were able to beach the Endeavour in what is now the Endeavour River. And fortunately, most of the natural history collection was saved. It was all taken out of the boat and laid out in the sun to dry. And the carpenters set to work to repair the ship. But they really can't imagine how intrepid these people were. They were absolutely all alone. If they hadn't been able to get off it, nobody knew where they were. Very unlikely that have survived. When we were working on the Endeavour plates, it was just a time when the Americans were still flying around the moon. And there was always a lot of talk about it, how, you know, for 15 minutes at the back of the moon, they were absolutely out of touch with the Earth. These people had been out of touch with any sort of civilization for 21 months. And it's absolutely astonishing that they had this resolve and resolution and actually skill to be able to put together a very broken vessel. They did start again, and they limped on up to Torres Strait. At that time, nobody knew, in fact, whether there was a strait from the south. They knew it would come from the north. And they stepped off very briefly at what is now New Guinea, where Banks swapped one of his greyhounds from a bird of paradise, which sadly never made it back to England. And they then finally hit civilization at Batavia, modern Java, with a Dutch colony. And ever punctilious Cook wrote a long dispatch about Voyage to be sent back in an East Indiaman, rather poignantly pointing out that in 2.5 years sailing, he'd never lost a single man from sickness. Very poignant, because Batavia was a notoriously unhealthy place. It fetid, horrible canals. And within 3 weeks, practically the whole crew, including Banks and Solander, went down with Batavian fever, sort of particularly nasty mixture of dysentery and malaria, the bloody flux. And in the course of the next few weeks and on the voyage home, a third of the crew died, and including Mr. Green, the astronomer, and Sidney Parkinson and Herbert Sporing, and also the 2 Tahitians, Tupaya and his son. They again did do some botanizing. Parkinson apparently did a lot of the collecting himself, and these are 2 particularly nice ones, I think. The one on the left was very useful for making string. It was also collected in Australia and was very good for tying up kangaroo roasts. And then they set off on the journey home. And the extraordinary thing is that while you and I would feel it pretty remarkable to sail from Java to England in a 300-ton flat-bottomed boat, they really took it as normal. I mean, excitement had gone out of it. They were in civilization. There was nowhere else to discover. They weathered a very nasty storm in the Indian Ocean and spent some time in the Cape of Good Hope, but there was no Parkinson to draw the plants, and they were longing to get home. And they went on to St. Helena and picked up a home-going fleet there. And on the 12th of July, 1771, oh, I never showed the print. I must remember to do that. These are lovely ones from Batavia, Java. The one on the right is particularly nice, I think. and they arrived back in Deal on the 12th of July, having circumnavigated the world in 3 years. And Banks and Cook and Solander immediately got in a coach and drove up to London. And Cook, really virtually entirely unappreciated, congratulated, went off down the Mile End Road to his long-suffering wife, Elizabeth. And Banks and Solander were catapulted into 18th century society, presented at court, and generally lionized and indeed lampooned. Here is Banks as the fly-catching macaroni, and Solander as the simply macaroni. And then began very laborious preparations for a second voyage in the Resolution, and without actually doing anything about the results of the Endeavour voyage. And Carl Linnaeus was in despair. He wrote, "By all that is great and good, I entreat you, who know so well the value of science, to do all that in you lies for the publication of these new acquisitions, that the learned world may not be deprived of them." And eventually Banks, who was rightly very proud of the results of the voyage and determined to publish the scientific record in the grandest manner possible, and fortunately had the funds to do so, set about it. But it was a tremendous undertaking. Parkinson had completed 280 of the 955 drawings he'd made before he died. And Banks employed 5 artists to work up his field sketches into finished portraits, mainly working in his library in Soho Square. And then for the next 13 years, 18 engravers made 745 exquisitely detailed copperplate line engravings, the best ones ever been made. And in November 1784, Banks was able to write to his friend John Ellis, saying, "All that is left is so little that it can be completed in 2 months, if only the engravers can come to put the finishing touches to it." And then he delayed. And had he published at the time, it would have become one of the most important botanical collections of all time, a real treasure of the Age of Enlightenment. All of the plants were new to European botany, and had all European type specimens, an extraordinary amalgam of exploration and science and art. So why didn't he publish? Well, there were all sorts of reasons. Solander, who was writing the botanical text, had died in 1782. And Banks, of course, was extremely busy. He was no longer the dashing young explorer of 1771. He'd been made director of Kew Gardens in 1773 and president of the Royal Society in 1778. And he had his finger in every single scientific pie around the world. And moreover, he was very generous with his collections. He kept open house in Soho Square. And you get the feeling that in a way he sort of always thought he published it. We know he gave some of the black proofs the engravers made when they finished their plates to other institutions. And I think actually the real reason was more prosaic and modern. There was an economic collapse in the time of the American War of Independence, and his income took an absolute nosedive with the collapse of the long wool trade to America. And whatever the combination of reasons, when Banks died in 1820 as the great panjandrum of British and European science, the Floral Legion was still unpublished, and all his collections, including the Floral Legion plates, were bequeathed first to his librarian, Robert Brown, and then in 1827 to the British Museum, where it's remained ever since. And over the intervening years, there have been a few rather feeble attempts to publish plates. It all came to nothing. At the end of the 19th century, some of the Australian plates, Australian prints, images were published not from the plates, but by photolithography in black from the black proofs. And it wasn't until 1962 that one of the senior curators in the botany department at the British Museum, Dr. William Stern, who had a long interest in the Endeavour Voyage, decided to take some of the plates down to the Royal College of Art printmaking department to see whether they were in good enough shape to print. And the result of that was that the Royal College of Art publication side eventually produced a very beautiful book with 30 of the plates printed in black, wrongly named Captain Cook's Floral Legion. It took them 10 years to do. In the course of the publication, 5 of the precious plates went missing. And 1962, as Julia said, was when we just set up Editions Elector to print and publish original prints by contemporary painters and sculptors, some of whom were either taught or left the Royal College of Art, or indeed was still there, like David Hockney. And actually my first etching printer had been poached by the college to be the technician at the printmaking department. So we were in the Royal College quite often. It was just up the road from our studios. And we saw these prints, these plates, and were absolutely knocked out, not just by the quality of the plates, but by the whole romance of this unpublished record from this amazing 18th century voyage. And rather impotently, we formed up to the director and said we'd like to publish them. And in view of our extreme inexperience and youth, we were politely told to go away. And it was only 17 years later, when I was in the British Museum of Natural History, researching a completely different project, that one of the botanical editors, the botanical curators there, Dr. Chris Humphreys, who subsequently became our botanical editor, said, had I ever thought of publishing Banks' Floral Legion? And there they still were, the 738 remaining plates still wrapped up in our 18th century paper, sitting in a great pile at the bottom of a cupboard in the Botany Library, about a ton of finest copper. And our original plan was actually quite modest. We thought we'd choose 50 of the most dramatic plates and print them in black. And then as we got into the project and began researching it and reading the letters, we came to the conclusion that Banks must at least have been thinking of printing in color. He was, after all, the great high technologist of the 18th century, and we know he'd been in touch with the French color printers. And at that time, I had in the etching department a rather bolshy, very young Welsh printer, severely dyslexic, but absolutely brilliant with color, and subsequently turned out to be an amazing manager, Edward Edgerton Williams. And I gave him two of the plates to do some experiments. And he started off, first of all, printing in very, very pale sepia and laying in all the color by watercolor. And that really didn't work at all because you obliterated a lot of the fine lines with the watercolor paint. And also it was terribly laborious and you couldn't get consistency of color. And eventually Edward stumbled upon a variant of a 17th century technique invented by a man called Johannes Tyler in the 17th century, called printing à la Poupee, where you identify all of the colors in the watercolor, which you want to have in the print, and you work the individual colors into the correct lines on the plate. And when all the lines are filled with the right colored ink, and all the area which you're going to print white has been wiped clean, you lay the inked up plate on the bed of the press and put over every damp paper and tissue and blanket to even out the pressure. And then you turn the great wheel of the press, and the whole thing goes between steel rollers with terrific pressure and forces the damp paper into the grooves of the plate. And when it comes out the other end, you peel it off like a transfer, and there you have one finished print. And then you begin the whole damn thing again, clean out any ink that is left, and start again. It's a very, very skilled process, and very time-consuming and laborious. But it does produce the most amazing results. And I took Edward's first proofs to Dr. Paul Hulton at the British Museum, and said, look what we've done, what do you think? And without a second's pause, he said, well, if Banks was looking at it now, this is the way he'd have had it done. And without, I'm afraid, completely realizing what I was letting myself in for, I said, right, we'll publish the lot. And 10 years later, we finished. And the first thing we had to do was to set up a new studio. The Floral Legion took over our contemporary work, which actually we had to abandon. And over the next 10 years, Edward managed and ran this amazing studio of 25 printers and colorists, mostly all very young people, fairly recently out of art school. They didn't all stay the course. There's 1 or 2 years probably. There were about 80 people were involved during the course of the publication, all of whose names are recorded. And after 10 years, in 1990, he had completed 116 sets of the 745 plates, 86,000 prints, and issued in 100 numbered sets. And then there were 10 sets all commerce outside the commercial edition for the publishers and collaborators, and exhibition and printers' proofs sets. It was an astounding achievement by Edward Edgerton Williams. It was unquestionably the biggest graphic printing project ever been undertaken. And very fortunately, we found subscribers for the 100 sets, all of which, of course, have disappeared into university and museum libraries and very serious private collections. And it always seemed to me that it was a great pity not to have a trade edition, as it were, for the general public. And I couldn't find a publisher. And then in 2016, I think, Thames and Hudson wrote out of the blue and said they'd like to produce a book, and duly have produced the most beautiful book with 175 color illustrations and descriptions of the voyage and all the botanical work and a bit by me about the printing. And we used that as a excuse to revamp our very, very ancient and antiquated website. And if you're interested at all, you can go to the website. The last slide, it's got the name. Now you'll be able to see all 745 images, plates, and a lot of other information. And if you're really interested, you can go to our online shop and buy one of the exhibition proofs. And if you do, 10% of the price will go to the Woodford Valley PCC. And actually, of course, there's no alternative read. The best thing is to see the real thing. And those of you who are local, if you are passing this way, I'd love to show you some of the prints here at the courthouse. You really can't overestimate the impact of the voyage on 18th century scientific world and society. It really was like bringing back treasures from another planet. Banks and Solander brought back 3,607 species and some 30,000 individual specimens, of which 1,400 were entirely new at that time. And the Floral Legion, as I said before, I think was so special because it was a wonderful combination of art and science, a true jewel of the Age of Enlightenment, and really through the skills of a lot of young men on there, young men and women. First of all, Parkinson's amazing skill of being able to portray the weediest weed as a beautiful 18th century portrait. And then the brilliance of the engravers who cut directly into the copper with a burin, making a network of lines to build up the whole image. So that every turn of a leaf and twist of a stem is made up by the width and depth of the line cut in the plate. And so that even if you print it in black, it's so detailed that scholars and botanists can use it for scientific purposes. And again, finally, the printers and colorists in Edward's studio who maintain this extraordinary degree of perfection for the whole time. And it's actually been a tremendous privilege to be involved in this project. I mean, not least because Captain Cook effectively became my travel agent. I journeyed around the world in the wake of the endeavour, drumming up subscribers. But above all, it's this direct connection with one of the most important voyages of discovery and two of the most remarkable characters of the 18th, and I think any other century. And if you go to the Botany Library and the Natural History Museum, which I thoroughly recommend, you can still find in Banks's own cabinet the dried specimens of all the plants they collected. This is Banksia serrata. And then you can go next door and see the notebooks of Solander written up by Herman Spurring. And again, next door, read the journals of Banks and Cook. So you can see what they were doing on the day they collected the things. And then you can look at the plates themselves. Now, encased in copper, we chrome face the copper plates to protect them while they were printed. And the black proofs the engravers took in the 18th century. And finally, in 35 enormous Solander boxes made actually to the design of Dr. Solander for a dust-proof box. The 745 color plates published by Electro. And honestly, I defy you not to feel at least a little tingle of excitement. I'm been rather sad in the last 2 or 3 years to find that Banks and Solander have been swept up in this extraordinary business of branding historical figures as racist and colonial exploiters. And for me, Banks and Solander were honorable men of their time, the finest navigator and explorer, and the most preeminent scientists and botanists of the 18th century. And they'll always remain for me 2 of my very great heroes. Thank you very much.
Need to come out.
Joe, that was a fantastic account of something that's very special. We do have a couple of questions. The first one is asks, did Joseph Banks go on any of Cook's second voyage on the Resolution? And I think you said no, actually, during your talk. Is that right?
He didn't, actually. He was very keen. He wanted to go. And actually thought he had a God-given right to go. And I think the lionization he had when he arrived really went to his head. He became a tremendous egotist, and he made all sorts of outrageous demands to have a full band in the next voyage and build a huge superstructure on the deck to make an enormous cabin. And the pilot who was taking the boat downstream to test it refused to go beyond Greenwich because he said it would capsize, and Banks left in a huff and took his party off to Iceland. And there's rather a nice coda to this, because as well as the full band and the new cabin, he thought it rather amusing to take his current mistress, and he'd had her dressed up as a boy and shipped off to Madeira, and actually forgot to tell her that he wasn't going on the voyage. And poor Miss Burnett had to be rescued later on and brought back to England. I think he probably looked after her quite well. He was a generous man.
Yes, yes. And one other here. How did you fund the printing venture? 10 years work before you could actually sell the sets.
Well, no, it wasn't actually that. It was looking back at an incredible punt, actually, because we really had no idea whether people wanted it or how to price them. And what we did was we published them in parts.
Right.
boxes with 20 or 22 prints in each. And when people subscribed, they they bought the first part. And when we delivered the first two parts, they paid for the next two parts. So we were always one part ahead. And actually, we also raised the price with inflation. It was at a time when there was raging inflation. But it was quite lucky. And we were very lucky because it was a time of great optimism, actually, and particularly in Australia. It was just coming up to their bicentenary. And they were actually rather proud of their history. They got over the fact that they were a nation of convicts. And we had tremendous reaction from people in Australia and gave me confidence to go on.
Yes, yes. One question's just come up here. It says, you mentioned it's possible to purchase the Floral Legion. Is it now in individual prints?
Yes, we do. We do actually have one complete set from the Orcomas sets. But on our website, there are individual prints from the 3 exhibition sets we made, which have been actually languishing in my store for the last 30 years. They're really beautiful. And it is like buying them from Marks and Spencer. You just go onto the website and online, and you can buy them there.
Yes, yes. Somebody's just actually asked, what is the website? This is editions, yes, edition Electo.
It's called electo-historical-editions.com. It's frightfully tiresome. Electo is spelled A-L-E-C-T-O, like the Greek fury, and historical editions. But if people want to know, I know they got your email, and
yes,
they have to ask you.
Yes, absolutely. We can definitely email that out. There says another question here. Was there any analysis of medicinal properties of any of the plants, as there was when Columbus traveled?
Well, it is true that they did have a thought for selecting plants which had a commercial interest rather than medicinal interest. I think they did have slight, but I don't think either anybody on board would have any particular medical knowledge. So I really can't answer that question.
No. And perhaps a final question, Joe. Just having a look here. If the wealthy Banks was deterred from publishing in the 18th century, oh no, we've actually covered that question. Were there any descendants of Banks? Do we know?
Well, there were no legitimate descendants of Banks. I think there may have been a couple of side blades. He was quite a lad when he was a young man, and maybe there's some Tahitians who owe something to his lineage. But he didn't. He married Dorothea Edgerton and had a very happy marriage, and they lived in a menage a trois with his sister, Sarah Sophia, and all 3 of them, all 2, were great collectors in their own right.
Fascinating. Well, Joe, honestly, what a wonderful talk you've given us this evening. I think we're all now full of admiration for both Cook and for Banks. And anyone who looks at the finished works cannot help but be overcome by the infinite patience, care and scholarship that has gone into the printing of Banks's Floral Legion. And thank you so very much for giving us this talk and raising really a great sum for the Woodford Valley Churches. And thank you to everybody who has dialed in tonight. And so we will leave it there.